Evans, and today I'm joined by a favorite, Bruce McIndoe, WTCI member, board member, and president of McIndoe Risk Advisory. How you doing, Bruce?
Doing pretty good. It's always a rough world out there.
Yeah, so today we're gonna it's not even brief, we're gonna chat about how expensive war can be.
Our
Unless
being.
Yeah, our being, yes, because we are currently in one. And it's really expensive unless you're the one like selling the weapons, which, Ukraine and Iran have quietly emerged as the dominant players in this global combat drone market. So, we are going to unpack how this drones arm race is basically rewriting the economics of defense, the implications of global stability, and the looming reality of autonomous mass produced robot armies.
Woohoo.
Something I thought I would never say, but here we are.
Yeah, here we are.
So, Bruce, most people think about Ukraine as a recipient of a lot of military aid, but now we're
And they
looking
are.
at
And
them. Yeah, they are, but now we're looking at them, they become an exporter at the same time. When did that happen?
um, yeah, I would say it happened when Ukraine moved from being mainly a consumer of Western military aid and technology, right, to becoming what I would call a real-time defense technology innovator, born out of necessity. But Ukraine has such deep technology and engineering expertise. It's not surprising that they would step up and be amazing. But the drones are the clearest example. I mean, they were under attack. They were forced to design, test, lose, learn from that, redesign, produce, all of that and scale all of that at war is just so amazing. And so they're now in a unique position that they're still, dependent on Western and foreign support, no question about that. But
Right.
they have these, battlefield tested systems now that other countries, like in Saudi Arabia and Japan and others, that are like saying, we want that technology,
Yeah.
let's buy that. So I think that'll be a major, but it's not that they're just now exporting drones and even drones, technology. What I think, back to the combat validation. That's what they're bringing to the market, and people are going to want them. Yeah.
Yeah. When I think of Ukraine, the word that comes to mind is resilient.
Oh my God, yes, yeah.
So Iran has also been, in the weapons game, but a bit longer than the
A lot
Ukraine.
longer. Yeah.
How established is Iran as a drone exporter, and who's actually buying these drones?
One, they are incredibly established as a drone manufacturer. We see that with, Russia is probably the most visible buyer, right, of that. So, they learned early on that you don't throw, tens of thousands and $1 million missiles at a, you know, $10,000 problem, right?
Right.
But they've been using the Shahid drones that are, Iran's design that they have, and I would say most extensively is how they've been executing the war in the air anyway. So, but that's Iran has been sending the technology to their proxies, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, and militias in Iraq and Syria. So they've been a long time producer, distributor of that hardware. But I think I would say Iran was the early exporter of not just the hardware, but this model that you talked about in the opening, right? The changing dynamics of war, this low cost strike
Right.
capability, the technical know-how that other countries and rebel groups and things can pick up, and so I think that and today we're going to talk a lot about, why Iran matters so much in this transition, and what they've proven against the United States military, right, in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it's just, yeah, it's quite a transformational change for military defense and us, the world.
Yeah. So the math, it's a little crazy. A $20,000 drone force, it's basically forcing the other side to use $2 million missiles to stop
Exactly.
it.
Right.
From a business standpoint, how does that lopsided cost break traditional defense budgets, and how countries decide what weapons to buy?
Anyway, so what you laid out is the core economic disruption driving defense planning across the globe, right? You have an incoming, what'd you say, $20,000,
$20,000 drone.
weapon, right? And you're sitting there with $1 million or multi-million-dollar missiles. What are you going to do? You have to fire them, right? So there's no question, and the U.S. led this, that for my career, right, decades, defense planning favored the next exquisite system, right? Advanced aircraft, precision missiles, high-end interceptors, ICBMs, on and on and on, right? These multi-million, multi-billion-dollar programs, and they still matter in the grand scheme of things, but drones create a brutal cost
Yeah.
imbalance, right? So if I can send a $20,000 drone and you have to throw a $2 million interceptor, I don't have to win, and Iran has shown that they don't have to win every attack, right?
Exactly.
But what they make is they make the nation state's defense cost financially unsustainable. So
Yeah.
so that's kind of the mechanism, but there's more to it, right? It completely changes procurement, because they have to ask, like, what does it cost per shot, right?
Right.
And how can we produce things at scale, and what can we afford to lose, right? Because we can't, we don't want to, if I'm protecting a site, let's say it's a pumping station or whatever, that, and it's like, is it really worth spending 10, 50, $100 million to protect it? Just
Yeah.
let the Shaheed hit it and we'll
And we'll
repair it,
rebuild.
right? So anyway, and the future, and we're seeing that here, the whole concept around the Iron Dome and all that, we have to now look at a layered defense system of anti-drone and electronic warfare, and of course directed energy that we're doing, and all these things. So that's really where what's happening here, and what happens here gets exported to at least our friends in the world. And the winner's not going to be the one with the most advanced system. It's going to be the ones that imposes the worst cost curve, right? That would be the business side. And yeah, so that's what's happening in the halls of the Ministry of War, right?
So Ukraine and Iran are both selling these battle-tested technologies,
Yeah.
but in many cases they have gone head-to-head. But they sell different things. Ukraine is largely pitching defense intercept systems, and Iran has built export market around offensive strike drones. Which country's product would you say has the most value in the global markets?
In the near term, and a lot of this has to do with human behavior, I think, but I think Iran's offensive model is going to probably have broader market appeal, right?
Agreed.
One, it's cheaper, it's simpler, and it's attractive to groups, whether it's nation states or, like I said, rebel groups or whatever. Instead, they don't have to build a modern air force. They can just buy these things, and now they have air power, right? So,
Right.
So I think in the near term, and well, not even, but even historically, of course, now, Ukraine has brought this technology. We'll continue to be, the one that's going to lead. But the defensive systems that Ukraine has done, and I think this is probably the most important thing, they're going to win in the strategic value, right? Because if the Middle East war, everyone now is watching on TV what drones can do to cities and energy grids and ports
A
and
live
ships,
demo.
and right. So it creates a huge demand now for counter drone defense, right? So I would see the volume will grow in that arena. It'll be a much more sustained growth because all nation states that have critical infrastructure and high value assets are going to want to start to protect them, right? And again, that's what I'm look at when we talk about the golden drone, right? Here that we're going to be having protective layers around the United States of critical infrastructure, not only through anti-drone technology, but obviously space and other technologies. So yeah, the real growth market, I think, is not just drones. It'll be the full drone ecosystem, right? Detection, jamming, interception, all that stuff is what's going to be the real market.
And it's crazy because Iran basically built this drone industry despite having all these sanctions on it. Like they've been smuggling parts, reverse engineering tech. What does this tell you about the effectiveness of these sanctions when a country can still build and sell advanced weapons in the global market?
Sure, and we've seen that
Yeah.
historically, right? That sanctions basically slow a program. Look at the Iranian nuclear program, right?
Yeah.
And it raises their cost and it complicates supply chains and all those things, but it does not deter them from their objective, right? So, the Iranians, they built this program within a sanctions environment through smuggling, front companies, buying dual use technology,
Right.
just making scraping by everything that they could do. They had support from the Chinese, obviously, and as far as manufacturing. So the sanctions matter. You do want to slow down your adversary. You do want to make it more expensive and more difficult, but it's not a
Deterrent.
holistic strategy, right? So the bigger issue is that for us, the barrier to entry has fallen. So, a sanctioned country, an adversary, a terrorist group, whatever it is now, they can assemble dangerous weapons and access engineering talent to do it. The barriers are pretty low. Yeah.
So there's some experts that point out that our current global rules for arms deals aren't built for these kinds of drones. They don't even know if they should be classified as missiles or aircrafts. What
Right.
happens to world stability when rules, that apply can't keep up with the technology?
Yeah, we're seeing that, and we call that a governance gap, right? And when you have governance gaps, it becomes just destabilizing. It doesn't matter whether it's nuclear arms, whether it's AI, whether it's drones. That when you lose governance and lose control, it's very, very dangerous. Arms control treaties and things are built around very technical definitions of what it is that they're doing, right? Well, these things
Right.
are not, don't lend themselves to that. So, I would say when we look at governance, right? I guess kind of like when you don't have governance rules, basically first three things happen. First, you have proliferation will accelerate, right? Because sellers can just exploit ambiguity. Second would be the accountability weakens because it becomes harder to track, who supplied what, and is it, in or out of the regime, because that's ambiguous, and so all of that. And then third, which is the big problem, is escalation risk rises because, like I said, cheap systems can create strategic effects, right? We again, we're having this conversation in the forefront of the Middle East war, which is,
Right.
it's the technology and the warfare and what's happening is moving faster than our diplomatic mechanisms, levers, right?
Right.
So trying to, regulate or manage an industry that's evolving month to month is incredibly difficult, right? And
Right.
it, so and we're going to be dealing with this going forward. It's not ever going to stop, right? Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about other technologies, but we'll see.
So back to the money.
Okay.
The first 6 days of combat operations for the U.S. against Iran cost us 11.6 billion with B,
Uh-huh.
and now they're requesting another 200 billion. At what point do the numbers of this modern drone warfare kind of make you rethink how they budget and approach this conflict?
Well, the numbers you laid out already are forcing a rethink, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, this is that whole cost curve and just how outrageous it is in what's happening right now, uh, in the billions and billions of dollars that we are essentially destroying, right? I mean, these
Yeah.
are, missile systems and things that we're, you know, shooting off to try to protect, and also to, advance. But I look at it and strategically for the U.S., and I think this is the key pressure point right now with the administration. This is not just a total cost issue; it's a depletion problem,
Yeah.
right? So, high-end interceptors, missiles, drones, precision munitions, THAAD systems, all these things that are being destroyed or purposely launched because they're consumable, puts extreme pressure on the government to say we cannot sustain this because we are depleting our own defense. Look at the Pacific Theater, look at the home front, right? That
Right.
if we keep expending these, I mean, we're begging and not even, well, I guess borrowing if we can eventually replace, but we're moving munitions from other theaters and from partners to sustain what we're doing. So part of, Ron is sitting there saying, we're putting maximum pressure on the U.S. because they can't keep up,
Nope.
right, with that. So, I think we talk about that economic, it's right now we're sitting back here knowing that we have to figure out how to, get cheaper, munitions and be able to scale up our production, our defense industrial base, and so. I guess the core question for nation states around the world is: can your DIB, right, your defense industrial base, sustain the fight? Are you spending yourself into a strategic exhaustion and national debt? And that's where we are right now.
Yeah, I saw something I think yesterday that was like we've already depleted half of what we already had. And it's
Yeah,
like it's not sustainable at all.
yeah, and that's why I think right now, any modicum of exit ramp that the U.S. can find,
Yeah.
they're going to walk down
We're gonna need to jump
because,
off.
yeah. So,
So Ukraine is planning to open these production lines in Europe and launch joint ventures with the UK and Germany. Once this war ends, if it does,
uh-huh.
what does their defense industry look like? Is it more of a long-term business, or was it just, this boom that happened and it'll stop once the fighting stops?
Oh no, it's long-term business. War is big business.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, this is a multi-level conversation. Let's start with Ukraine. Ukraine's defense industry is absolutely going to become a long-term business for them,
Mm-hmm.
not just this wartime boom. I mean, they excel in automotive and other areas as well, and I think it's incredibly natural that's going to go. I mean, they have something now the market values, and the systems have been pressure tested, and
Mm-hmm.
anyway. So that's the nucleus, right? Ukraine. But the bigger picture is Europe is also becoming a
Mm-hmm.
defense giant, right? Because they're saying, look, we can no longer depend on the United States. So now we're going to turn inward, and France and Germany, they're all
Mm-hmm.
ramping up to build these kinds of systems
Mm-hmm.
within Europe and the EU, not relying on the US. So we're going to see the world in this transition say we don't need these exotic, massive systems that we've traditionally acquired from the US. We're going to build, essentially
Mm-hmm.
homegrown technology that's for the new battlefields ahead, right? So that's it's like a double whammy. One, bad for us, and two, good for the Ukrainians, right?
Yeah.
So,
We're definitely on the losing end of that. We were talking about drones, and we've been talking a lot about drones, but technology is moving quickly towards these autonomous swarms. At what point does this move from just selling remote control aircrafts to selling actual like robot armies that can think and act for themselves? Are we headed for Terminator?
um, no, I think it's this is a complicated, now we get into really complicated stuff. I think the military and the planners really understand that these um, multi, we call swarm, right, where you have
Mm-hmm.
multiple robotic. Let's focus on drones right now. We see them when they do this light shows and all
Mm-hmm.
of that kind of stuff, right? Just how amazing they are. So having that where you can have them communicating with each other, they have sensors on them, and can deploy their payload is an incredibly complicated mess to deal with and try to defend against, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the things we're concerned about around our shipping and the battleships and aircraft carriers, to have these swarms coming at them and not being able to defend themselves. So
Right.
the I guess the central ethical and operational issue is, do we keep the human in the loop, right?
Right.
And I think the traditional answer has been yes, we want to keep them, but again, in high speed drone warfare, I think it becomes, if not harder, almost impossible, right? So I think it's like building checks and balances in the systems,
Mm-hmm.
that if we don't have kind of clear target viability, that they won't act, right? So if you're going after a battleship, if you're going after a tank, or if you're going after a lat long, maybe it's a fuel depot or whatever it is, those would be like predefined targets, and
Mm-hmm.
we're going to go after them, and let the drones do their thing, right? If we're in residential, or if we're in we don't have clear target identification, then I think that's when the humans still need to be in there. So I think it's going to be hard around where's that line, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so it's that's drones. We haven't even talked about when we start having robotic armies, right? So which are
Yeah.
uh,
Real. It's coming.
yeah.
And so you think we're headed to a future where we just let AI decide when to pull the trigger, not for that?
No, no, I'm saying is we're not going to. What we're going to do, I think that the protocol will be clearly identified target,
Hmm.
right? And so if we can do that through AI, or if we do that through remote operator, or whether we do that by clear intelligence, like a munitions depot or whatever it may be, then I think they will be more autonomous, right? Because we'll have clearly identified the target and we're going to say, go take it. It's more in the dynamic environment where, you have a bus going down the road, and is that full of school children or, military personnel that are being relocated, right? And so that's where I feel like the line will be that you need to have that target identification and validation before you wipe it out, right? And that's going to get harder and harder.
For sure. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up, but stepping back, these are two very different countries, Ukraine and Iran, and they have very different political contexts, but they came to the same conclusion that these drones are scalable, exportable, and, shaped by this experience that they've had. What does the world look like in 5 years if this trajectory continues?
So it will continue. I have high confidence. And 5 years from now, given the pace of technology evolution, I would say it's not only drones, but it will be robots. Will be a normal part of military power. Not some niche capability. More and more countries are going to build domestic drone industries. They're going to do joint ventures. They're going to export. They're going to bring in robotic technology, right? They'll use robotic technology for logistics, for support functions, but in time, and the 5 year window might be a little bit tight, but I can see Russia, working with China to deploy essentially robotic soldiers, right, that can kind of push through the line and they've lost hundreds of thousands, million personnel in the war with Ukraine, in having trouble to recruit people, right, to go, because they you get out there on that front line and it's just a meat grinder. So so I think that that's really, I guess, the bigger shift, and that means that, and we've seen this, like I said, the proposed the golden dome, kind of like the Israeli Iron Dome, is really what's going to be happening. Countries are going to be building cheaper systems to protect strategic assets, right? And those defensive systems will be robotic. They'll be drone, air capability, and we'll just, and I think the big weapon systems have seen their day. There'll be some just for show of force and be able to, transport large troops and that kind of stuff. But I think the shape of warfare in the future will be all that we've been talking about: drone, anti-drone, robotic systems, autonomous systems, is where it's going to be.
Interesting. Well, I hope that, fingers crossed, we'll be out of this war pretty soon. And the war in the Middle East will be a talk of the past.
Yeah, well, it's, like we said, it's not sustainable. So it will, I think, come to a pretty rapid close.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, Bruce, as always. Yes. It's lovely to chat with you. And thank you all for listening. For more insights like these, member news, and events, visit WTCI.org and be sure to follow us on all our social channels at WTC Institute. Until next time.